Welcome back to another tonic discussion. Today we are talking about everything from persuasion to rhetoric, propaganda, truth. What's the differences? What are the similarities? How does it have to do with writing, everyday interactions? That's what we're going to try and talk about. And it might get meandering because it's a complex topic. And all those words do mean different things to different people, loaded with connotations. And so we'll try and get into it. First off, I want to pass it over to Mark 'cause before we were talking, he was saying something really interesting about how, you can get into a conversation with somebody and, get to a point where it's like you feel like you're making a good argument, the argument there is resonating, but then you get to this point where it's like, well, honestly, I don't really care about that. I'm trying to go on with my day. And Mark, pass it on to you. Let you expand on that.
All right. So the way that I kind of look at it when I get into conversation with someone about a topic of substance, it's something along the lines of this. I think it goes something like a person. First of all, I think everybody wants to have an opinion that matters about things that matter. Like at the baseline, there's something in our nature where if we're asked a question, the last thing we want to do is say something like, well, I don't know. Like, I don't know is almost like the elemental human cuss word. Because to say I don't know is to admit to some sort of weakness, like a deep weakness, not just a weakness in one area, but a weakness in being almost like so. So if we were talking about something like I mentioned the anecdote of masks before, like I had an experience recently at a hospital where it became very clear that like a lot of arguments, say pro masking arguments, are deployed for the reason of a kind of an armor or a chaff or a camouflage against something which most people don't want to admit to themselves. So that something would be something along the lines of, I know that this doesn't make sense. I know that ultimately something's wrong with this, but because I also want to get through my day, because I don't want to lose what little I have, because I also don't want to hold myself out to potential social ostracism or to some sort of opprobrium by strangers or by people that I know. Like in other words, like there's this instinct to say I need to have an argument ready to go. I need to defend whatever it is I want to do at the moment for whatever reason. And when you peel that away, like if you haul out studies, if you haul out evidence, if you provide a very detailed explanation about why what you're saying makes no sense, if you do that one by one, um, ultimately I think, and most of the time I've found that at the bottom of it, what they will do is they will kind of throw up their hands and say, you know what, I didn't really care about this to begin with, and it's such a deflating feeling, like once you scratch away that surface, and you because like these people aren't necessarily bad people. They're not necessarily stupid people. They're in many cases they have like qualities that are admirable, but when you peel all that away and you see that sort of, I like to call it kind of an elemental terror in their eyes when they realize that like the weapons I was provided, the armor and shields that I was provided were not worthwhile. They were not proofed properly. Um, uh, then you see like this underlying nihilism in all of it. Like you see, mankind sort of stripped naked, where it's just sort of like because the fact of the matter is like very few of us know more than a little about a very few topics when we get right down to it. Like when we talk about etymology or ontology or epistemology are ways of like knowing what we think we know. Like it becomes very, very fragile at a certain point. And I would admit to that too. It's like sort of like I'm not, when we write, and we're all writers, and when we write, we try to write with some kind of authority. And I don't think it's a pretense. I think that the best writers are trying to self-examine. They're trying to look at their own arguments critically. The best writers, and I think that the best thinkers do that too. They're constantly challenging their own interior positions. We're constant, like a writer of salt will just look at what they wrote and review it and say, like, how could this be easily defeated? Or how can it be defeated even with like an immense arsenal at your disposal? And it's sort of like, so that process, I would say, would be more along the lines of deliberative rhetoric, right? Where you're saying, like, I'm assembling an argument because I sense something in it is true. It may not be impregnable. There may be flaws in it. There may be gaps in it, but I'm not afraid of those being exposed. I'm not just deploying some sort of armor, whether it's social or economic. Like I'm not just coming up with the easiest answer to complex issues. But the problem is that I think the majority of people do that, and it's not a slander against them in my mind. Like in my mind, it's sort of like it's like that's just the consequences, the wages of life to some degree. Like there's none of us here or anywhere that don't have something precious that they want to protect, and like oftentimes that precious thing is very normal. It's just a paycheck, or it's just or it's just like I just want to have a nice dinner with my family, or I want to experience some little snippet of joy in all of this chaos. And I think so I think in some degree, to some degree, and this might be controversial, um when we write, to some degree we do become arms dealers, in the sense that we are providing a better kind of weaponry for those people that just want to live their lives, that want to live their lives as freely and as joyfully as possible. And I would say, like, that's unfortunately what the other side is trying to do as well. And like where the rubber meets the road is like, well, and the difference maybe between deliberative rhetoric and propaganda is we are trying to actually do it in a way that makes people freer and makes them happier in the long run. Whereas the propagandist proper is just trying to preserve their own little circles of power, no matter what the expense is. They don't really care what the end result of their writing is, so long as it preserves a certain kind of perverse hierarchy. Um, as long as it preserves, and again, at the cost of all, like it doesn't matter. As long as the next moment is as beneficial to them as the last one, it could cost the world. And I'll open it up to somebody else at that point. As far as like the difference. Yeah.
When you say you were arms dealers, it makes it sound very exciting what we do on Substack weapons trading. Anyway, but no, what you said, like a few things you said in there. One was like the rhetoric versus propaganda distinction. And there's this, I'm not sure that I totally understand it, but there's something like from Buddhism, it's like this skillful means, because in a lot of religions, there's this, lying is sort of, fundamental type of sin or wrongdoing or whatever. So anyway, with Buddhism, it's like this, from what I understand, it's like this emphasis on truth, but then there's this sort of like concept of skillful means of like, if you need to persuade somebody, and usually there's like in the examples I've heard, like a paternalistic kind of relationship, like father with children, and you don't reveal the entire truth to them, but you don't lie either. It's kind of more like you selectively reveal things that that they need to do, and versus like, I guess this idea of like a noble lie that you hear people talk about, which we've talked about in other conversations before. It's like, there's nothing noble about lying. You know, at the end of the day, it's like the idea that you're going to deliberately engineer some falsehood and get like Plato's Republic, get people because they're too stupid to do it for the right reasons. So you're going to give them some total bullshit, reasons why they need to do to like basically a false religious narrative or something like that, and there it's like, I mean, it seems like when you do that, it's always like this Faustian deal with the devil that it's always going to take you astray and corrupt you. It's like there's this sort of, at the end of the day, like this belief in truth as and having your beliefs cohere with reality to the best extent that you can as a guiding light, or you don't place that above, like it. So it's kind of like that. And I guess C.S. Lewis brings this up in Mere Christianity, that like if you want truth, then you may find at the end, of a long journey, like that you have comfort and joy and peace of mind, all these other things as well. But if you start off with, I'm going to aim for those things first, and truth is kind of secondary, if it's ever seems to conflict with my desire for comfort and satisfaction and all that, I'm going to scrap truth and just go for that and worry about truth later. And it's like, that never works. You wind up with, delusions, and, it undermines whatever it was that you were pursuing in the first place with the truth and stuff. But something, and I'll pass it along in just a second. John Carter, who's not here, he had a post called "The Truth Hurts," where he talks about, like, I guess trying to make sense of like all the craziness during COVID. And something you said, Mark, reminded me of that. So I guess there's like this: why would you cling to a lie? You talk about like you go through arguments, you dismantle somebody's argument, show them the reasons why their arguments are wrong, and then at the end of the day, they just throw down this, well, I don't care, I'm going to do this anyway, whatever the reason is. And sometimes they rationalize it by, I've had these debates where they'll end up saying, well, everybody does that, nobody really believes these things, kind of like this real cynical, jaded view. And they'll just, I don't care, what the data shows or what the evidence shows or whatever. But then it's like you get two things. There's like the truth hurts, and there's the desire to avoid losing face. And of course, that's another thing. Like once you've publicly said, this is what I believe and this is true, and then somebody shows you that it's not true, it's like there's that temptation probably to double down or weasel your way out of it somehow, rather than acknowledging, all right, I didn't know what the hell I was talking about, and you're right, I was wrong, about this, and or whatever. It's like, but if you do that, it's like the only way to, maintain your integrity, I guess, but most people don't do that, because it's like, it's in the short term, it seems like I can avoid losing face by doubling down on my beliefs or attacking you ad hominem or whatever. But then there's the whole truth hurts and aspect that, which is a great post.
Yeah, and that's great that you use the word integrity, because like it's a word that I've been contemplating. Obviously it means being whole. And so like when you say doubling down, like it's interesting because at the same time, to me at least, it means something like disintegrating. So it's sort of like by holding two contradictory ideas in your head, and by again, like sort of like maintaining this hypocrisy, like right down to the moment when you are defeated in logic, when you're defeated in reason. It's just sort of like at the bottom, like you find a disintegrated being. You find someone who fundamentally, like at some level, has been split and can't integrate like their needs of the moment with like sort of longer term, horizontal kind of uh, experience.
Like emotionally,
of like
they identify with their belief in some way. So you're attacking or they perceive it as an attack on their identity. If you're like, well, your belief is wrong,
or like part of their identity, because like there's another part, like even in the admission that like I don't care ultimately, like it's just sort of like, but you spent the last hour pretending to care, or did you pretend? Like does some part of you care and some other part of you not care, and like that doesn't make any sense. Like ultimately you see a kind of disintegrated sort of being, like a disintegrated mind. And like it's kind of like, so reintegrating would be like, I not only I'm not ever going to pretend to care about something that I don't care about. And then when I'm confronted with evidence about my beliefs that I find actually, um uh like if I find that compelling, like I have to confess to that. And if I don't, then I no longer, I cease, I become less human in some ways. Like I mean that in like, in the sense of like, I become less whole, I become less of a person, because like a person, I think, is not some sort of labyrinth of various interests and whatnot, but like rather somebody that can assess a situation, that like gets data coming in, and like and can hold it in their mind, and can push it up against like sort of every other instance of things that they knew, that they've experienced, and like come up with a complete answer. And if you can't do that, if it's all contingent, if it's all in the moment, then like I think that is a person that is fragmented. And like, I think to some degree that describes
Would you
basically
say?
everyone who leads the regime.
Would you say that? I mean, like somebody like that, like their chief overriding goal, or borrow the phrase from Jesus, you can't serve two masters, you love one, hate the other, or vice versa. Like that their top priority is their status and looking good, not looking bad, like look and being better than you in that moment. And so here's this
In the
thing.
moment, yeah.
This is like, all right, you have this belief, I'm better than you as a person because you have this belief and it's wrong for these various reasons. You undermine all that and show that, well, those reasons are actually not legitimate. And at the end of the day, and they still double down. I'm curious if you think this is the case, because some people do articulate this, and I wonder if some maybe mean this but don't have the intellect or the self-awareness to articulate it. But there's this kind of like, at that moment they go with what's left, which is, well, you're kind of like this, I'm stronger than you because you're bound by these moral considerations, or this consideration around truth. And that's I'm free to believe what I want, I'm not bound by truth or morality, like almost like almost like a do what thou wilt is the whole law kind of attitude, like that. It's thrown out as a justification, not of why their belief is good, but why they are still better than you. Like you've shown them this thing, and at the end of the day, they're like, yeah, I reject your game that you're playing with logic and morality and all that. I'm not bound by those things. You can be bound by those things lesser person than me. Like, do you think that, because some people will actually say that, and I wonder if those that don't say it, maybe it's like the lack of self-awareness or intellect to articulate that, but is that kind of at the back of it? Maybe it's not, but what do you guys think?
Well, I think that I'm going to try to tie a bunch of this stuff together. I think that most people do have a very basic desire or need to create some kind of coherent, picture of the way the world works. So I think before we started recording, we were kind of wondering about truth, and does everyone, like Daniel, I think you were saying that, you had this idea that, that everyone had some desire for the truth, and it's kind of weird seeing people not act that out. But I think there is a truth in that I think most people, at the very least, like they're seeking for meaning, and by that what I mean is they're seeking for things to make sense. They're trying to create a picture where there are good reasons for things, where things fit together. I think you could say that is roughly a desire for truth, but it's not like it always works, because there are so many options on the table, right? So we've got these things in the world, these things that we experience that don't necessarily, like the connection and the explanation for them isn't immediately apparent. So there are multiple possible explanations for them, multiple theories, multiple interpretations that will put them together in a picture that makes sense, that's coherent. And so oftentimes it could just be random circumstance that will latch on to certain connections, certain interpretations, and now we've got a picture. We've got a worldview. We've got a way of putting all these things together, a way of making sense. and making sense of the world. But it could be, for all we know, it could be completely wrong. But we don't know that. All we know is it feels good because it makes sense. And so, in so in a sense, maybe it's like a desire for truth that inspires the search for in the first place. But what we get as a result isn't necessarily the best answer, the best way of putting things together. So now what we have is a person, which is most of us, who have this picture that we've created for ourselves, roughly, or that's partially been created for us, that roughly works. You know, it makes sense. We've got an explanation for the things that we see in the world and for the problems that we're trying to solve on some level. But then this there are like at least two human tendencies that we all pretty much have. One of which is, well, just egotism. So the feeling that we're right, and the trust that we put in the conclusions that we've come to in the world. So it's like, okay, well, now I know, and I'm secure in knowing what I know, and then we get to be a bit, we get to be assholes about it, because then now we know, so now we can tell other people that we know, and we can we can make fun of other people or put them down for not knowing. And this is what happens when we get into arguments with people. It's like, okay, I'm right, I've got it figured out, now I'm going to let you know. So there's this egotism involved, and then there's also just the very basic, which is related, very basic, cognitive bias of confirmatory thinking or confirmatory bias, where now, because we've formed this picture, what we want is, when we see evidence in the world, we like selectively choose out the stuff that supports what we already think, and the stuff that disagrees with it, the disconfirming evidence, it's like, well, we don't want to look at that, because like one of you guys was quoting the maybe Mark Twain quote about Mark, was that you that brought it up? What was that quote?
It was Grant.
That was Grant.
Okay. Yeah. What was that one, Grant? Just
it's easier. It's easier to convince.
To fool.
It's much easier to fool a man than to convince him that he's been fooled. Right. So none of us want to look like an idiot, because we want a picture that makes sense. And when it turns out that we've got a picture that it doesn't map to reality, it doesn't feel good. We don't want to admit that. So we get this situation where I think that's what the environment, the inner environment that most people are in, where most of us have been fooled about some things. Some people have been fooled more than others, and no one wants to admit that they've been a fool. So what do you do in that circumstance? So one of the things that we were talking about before recording was, well, so writing, for instance, trying to be persuasive. Is it worthwhile to write a piece to a group of people that you see are in that situation, that don't really see something that you think is important, that you think you've got a more like objective, a better view of? Like, how do you do that, and is there a point in doing it? And so I was kind of thinking about that, and looking at it like writers, like people like us on Substack, were like arms dealers giving people better weapons. Well, I think I was thinking about two different approaches to this, two different ways of writing and persuasion. And one would be, to provide a better weapon. So this is a kind of confirmation that you're basically saying, okay, yeah, you're right, we all agree, now here's a better argument. Or the kind of pace and lead thing, where it's like, okay, here, my dear readers, you might all already agree with me about this, and so you write out stuff that they might already agree with, that isn't too far out, that won't push too many buttons, but then you just add in a few more things that maybe someone hadn't thought of before. So in that sense, you're providing some upgraded weaponry or ammunition, but utilizing that feature that we all have of wanting to seek out confirmation for what we already believe, maybe just upgrading it to a degree. But what do you do for a topic or a situation where someone might just be wrong about it? Well, maybe the thing to do there is to kind of recapitulate one's own process. Like, I know I've done this a couple times, but it's not really a habit of mine. But to kind of be like, well, I was where you're at, or just say, well, this is what I used to believe, or this is the way I used to see things, and then kind of guide through the process that you yourself went through.
to kind of just like in a dramatic work as a kind of catharsis, where you take someone through an experience that maybe they've not been before, and by experiencing it vicariously, they can kind of follow through the process and learn with you as you've learned, because that's one of the things that I think we don't teach, and we aren't taught, and that we don't learn very well, is how to go through that process. Because another thing that came up in the discussion was that we don't it's probably a lot more healthy to say and to admit I don't know, but none of us want to do that. So is it possible to train yourself, or would it be possible to train kids from a young age to develop the habit of, oh well, I think it is that do you know that there's nothing wrong with not knowing it? Like, it's probably start out with that, with that statement. Start out with you don't know, and then try to find the truth. Like, I think it's probably possible to teach habits of thought, habits of mind from a young age. We just don't do it. And because Mark, you brought up like the word disintegrative. Well, there's another another context to use that word in, and when you are confronted with being wrong about something, someone presents you with some facts that they're totally outside of that framework that you've come up with, that way of making sense of the world. It breaks something inside you, right? It's uncomfortable. That is in itself like a disintegrative state, where part of you is seeing, okay, I'm not jiving with reality. I'm not in tune with reality here. There is some kind of disconnect. There is some kind of fundamental like disintegration within myself, and by extension my relationship with the world. So I think that
it's a damage. It's a form of damage, and it can be productive damage, or it can be destructive damage, right? Like, it's sort of like, so the damage that, well, ultimately productive, right? Like, like where it's building instead of destroying. In other words, it's sort of like again, like developing muscles, right? It's just sort of like, that's productive damage. Whereas scarring is, you could say I think I've said it before, that scarring is muscle in a strange way. These things are connected, right? So like what Harrison, I think, is pointing to is something I deeply agree with, which is that, like, maybe the ultimate difference is, like, can you be punched in the face and grow from that? Like, can you take a loss? Can you take a kick in the teeth? Like, can you take damage and, like, in some way figure out how that leads to greater integration and growth? Like, does that healing process make you stronger, or does it turn you into, like, a cripple of some sort? And like, that's the difference. And so, like, so as if we're going with the arms dealer analogy, like, what I would say, or maybe we're talking about armor, whatever we're talking about, in terms of like giving people answers to questions that they are going to feel embarrassed not having any answers for. That could go in a couple of different ways. And the destructively damaging way would be something like, I'm going to give you an absolute answer. You're going to be able to use this answer in this one compartmentalized situation. You're going to be able to use this, like, in order to, clown or own your social enemies. Like those answers are pretty obvious to spot, because they are single use. They are disintegrated, essentially. They're not part of a larger strategy towards assessing, like, true things more generally, right? This is sort of like, there's a kind of a generalist principle to the best writing, I think, where it says, like, well, this agrees with everything else that this person has said. This is not a special scenario. This is not a special pleading kind of a situation. Like, I can apply this principle in basically all of these various sort of situations. And like, that's, to me, that's, at least that's me. Like, to me, that's how I try to assess, like, how truthful something is. I say, like, well, absent any particular situation, how much does this lend to, like, a more general strategy towards, towards truth, towards light, towards illuminating subjects rather than cloaking them. It's like I was thinking about, I said disintegration, but I also thought about the Clinton years and about how the word, this neologism, this compartmentalization came into play, which is like that was during the Monica Lewinsky situation. Like that, it was a word that entered the lexicon. Compartmentalization, and it's sort of like what you're really talking about again is sort of like a disintegration of being, where like really there is no method for assessing truth because everything is a unique special case. Everything is special pleading. Everything is designed to assess something in the moment, and a momentary problem, a momentary obstacle that's right in your way. Whereas you can't really see any farther afield. You can't like I'm a big proponent of like one of the main things that distinguishes humans from all other fauna is our ability to see the future. It's not a small thing. Like it's sort of like, it's like this was a different discussion that we had when we were talking about the difference between animals and humans. And to me, like maybe the biggest difference is like the idea that we can see further to that horizon. We don't just see the obstacle that's right in front of us. We can imagine like a whole series of obstacles and sort of routes, like in roads ahead of us. And like so when people are just using an argument to address the thing that's right in front of them, which might just be a person that they have personal animus against, someone that they genuinely dislike or just afraid of in some social way. They're afraid of being told off by this person or embarrassed in some way by this person because they hold A, B, and C beliefs that don't align with theirs, in a political way. Like you see that constantly. You see that where it's just sort of like, well, I'm just going to disagree with you on general principle. I don't care what the thing is. What gun can I grab off the shelf in order to fight you off? Because like on this, because like it's not really about the current thing. It's about like a sort of totality of things that like I also don't care about. I just don't like you. You know what I mean? I just don't like what you're about. I know that you're a different tribe. I sense that you're on a different path. And so yeah, so I think like that's the biggest difference. I think like the weapons that are provided by the propagandists are all disintegration ray guns, essentially. Like they're all about like sort of tearing apart connections. They're all about like making things smaller, making every single issue its own issue and singular. Whereas like, I would say that the weapons that are provided by someone who is, again, like sort of engaged in a deliberative rhetoric that is, that's about like the horizon, that's about like something that is a little bit more difficult to see. Those are more sort of I don't know if there's an opposite of a disintegrator, but like, yeah, if there was, like, I would think it'd be something that like kind of makes things whole, like something like I don't know if there's a science fiction device, but maybe something
the
that Bones
Integratron.
wielded on the Enterprise. I don't know. Like something that like brings like that like pieces things together in a orderly and logical and sensible way, and like that agrees with itself in every single case. Doesn't obviously we can't we're always going to be subject to some elements of hypocrisy, but like imagine like not being able to even see that ever, like never examining it, like never like testing it. And like that's the difference to me. It's just sort of like, yeah, we're people that are on the lookout for agreement, like even self-agreement,
It's like
making sure that
the
yeah,
asymmetry between construction and destruction. I mean, like if all you want is to destroy, if you're a guerrilla force and you're just trying to just cause maximal damage, you don't care about civilian casualties or how you're going to rebuild after the battle or whatever. It's like you can just destroy it. I mean, you're not limited in the way that somebody who's trying to build something, and and is concerned about those other things like
Right.
truth or virtue
An
or whatever.
architect as
Right.
opposed to like a demolitions expert.
Yeah.
And like demolitions, no matter what you say, like you could say like, well, he's a very skilled demolitions expert. He knows how to take apart this building in the most effective and efficient and and it's just sort of like, yeah, okay, but it's still easier.
Yeah.
It's
There, I
still
think
easier because like just, yeah.
I was just gonna say, I think the best weapon against somebody like that, and specifically in today's world, those demolition experts tend to be kind of, he borrowed John's term, Marxist, these like narcissistic personality types, but then Marxist in their beliefs, or cultural Marxist. But it's like, is to reframe, because they always, I mean, a lot of the stuff that they say, it seems true, but only because the framing is so flawed and incomplete and deceptive. And it's like, so it's like attacking the framing, in an example of this, just to throw one out there, like the rhetoric around slavery and like how that is supposed to define America as like this original sin. White people have this guilt, like this. It's almost like this religious kind of notion of original sin, But then if you reframe it more broadly and say, well, where else in the world was slavery being practiced at that time? And it's like, well, throughout the world, every continent, including Africa, including the Middle East. And it's like, if you reframe it in that way and say, then which of these cultures ended slavery on their own terms without outside intervention from some other demographic coming in and forcing them to? It's like, well, Europeans, so it's like, it just changes the whole character when, instead of having an honest conversation about, say, slavery and its after effects and how to remedy that, what the Marxist is trying to do is just use it as a cudgel to just beat people and obtain power over them and manipulate them. And it's like so they use this dishonest framing in order to do it, it's like a guerrilla form of morality. And so there, it's like changing the framing is probably the best way to counter that tactic,
So I would think of everything in terms of persuasion as just you're selling ideas. So I think a good alternative, disintegration with propaganda versus integration with persuasion in trying to sell an idea. The most important thing to consider is that value is subjective. People have different values. So you have to sell whatever idea that you're trying to sell based on the person who you're trying to sell it to, their values, not yours. Because if you're trying to sell it based on yours, if their values are different, it's not going to do them any good. So it's the same principle of selling anything. The libertarian presidential candidate Harry Brown, back in the day, very successful businessman and salesman, wrote a book, The Secret of Selling Anything, and that's like the premise of the book. But it pertains to selling ideas too, and I think that's the fundamentally opposed method to propaganda. And to tie that into what Daniel was saying about framing, some of these people that are trying to frame things a certain way, they're not doing it in good faith. They're trying to frame it in a certain way to achieve some ends that they desire that we would not buy under any circumstances if we understood accurately what they want. So, what complicates the picture of this, battle of narratives in the marketplace of ideas is that some of the narratives being espoused by certain factions are mutually exclusive, and they're cast forth by factions that want each other destroyed. So there's not like this open marketplace where everybody's searching for truth. There's an open marketplace where everybody is trying to advance their self-interest. And for some people, and obviously there's some hubris involved in me asserting this outright, I'd say for us, advancing truth as best as we can see it, we consider that to be a part of our self-interest for whatever reason. And you could go into psychological and, environmental, genetic factors, whatever it is. There's something about certain people that make it so cognitive dissonance of not doing that is like, it's just not, juice isn't worth the squeeze. Because if I don't know about you guys, but if I was the kind of person that was comfortable lying to people, like willingly and openly, and engaging in the world and just naked cynicism, I would probably be wealthier than I am. And I would probably be higher on the status hierarchy in terms of the regime than I am. But I know that given who I am, if I had tried to take that path, that I'd be absolutely miserable, and I'd be dependent upon, pharmacologic aid in order to be able to do that on a continuous basis. So
Maybe that's why there's so many people on antidepressants in America and
yeah,
anxiety
maybe.
drugs.
I'll brag even more. I'd be a supervillain. Like if if my life had like taken certain, like if I had made certain decisions at certain nodes of my life, I'm sure I might be extremely wealthy. But again, like to your point, Grant, because I think it's an important distinction, right? Like this idea of I haven't read the libertarian book that you were talking about, but I imagine somewhere in that promotion of advertisement, the idea of writing being as a form of advertisement, uh, the keep it simple, stupid principle, the KISS principle, right, has to come into play at some point, I think, only because when you're trying to assemble an argument for an unknown, which is like essentially what we're all doing when we're writing to a kind of a vast unknown. And so that means that the fundaments, like the foundation of the argument has to be pretty simple. Like the way I would put it is something like we were talking about the competence hierarchy, right? It's sort of like, and I think we all agree with this, it's sort of like, well, a lot of stupid people are in charge of a lot of important things because somewhere along the way we lost our ability to determine competency, something like that. Or maybe we decided that something was more important than competence, right? Like that's a pretty simple argument. It doesn't have to go into race realism. It doesn't have to go into any sort of advanced graphs or charts or any complexities other than like, hey, competent people should be in charge of things that require competence. That's pretty simple, right? The more complex that argument gets, the more fiddly, the more components that we add to it. I don't know if necessarily we're going to persuade the type of people we want to persuade. Like in other words, if you look at somebody like Steve Saylor, right? And I have some things to say about all of that that lie outside the scope of this. But like the ultimate point is this: is sort of like, who are you convincing? Are you preaching to a choir, or are you trying to like to get across like the simple principle that, hey, competence matters because certain complex systems require it, and those are systems that affect your life, whether you like it or
Yeah,
not.
let's
You
look
know,
at this as an example. I think this is a really good example to kind of do a deep dive on, using that idea of selling things based on subjective value. So, to your point, I would like, if I was trying to persuade you, Mark, of my libertarian priors and their utility in advancing competence, right? For you specifically, what I would focus on is saying, hey, who gets to determine what competent is? That's a very difficult thing to ascertain. And no matter what you could try and argue, like whatever hypothesis you want to come up with, if you want to look at what has changed, the government has become more involved in intervening in what private enterprise discusses and determines and decides is competent. So unilateral authority to make hiring decisions has been infringed upon by interests outside of business. And that has been what has resulted in this change. And so to get back and get after what you think would be better, you know, based on your values and elevating competence, you know, we don't need to elevate competence explicitly because you can't do that because it's difficult to define and enforce. You just need to allow individuals to voluntarily decide how they're going to allocate, you know, their property. You know, so if that's a business, it's a business. If it's an individual, it's an individual. And in terms of who they hire, like they have all the incentive and the skin in the game in order to over time select for competence. But then it gets to other complex things where it's not necessarily competence is the only thing. There's things like loyalty, you know, where there's a long training pipeline and all these other factors that they're subtle and they're difficult to measure. And so we just don't want the people making those decisions being people that have no skin in the game. So that's the argument that I'd make to you. Now, when it comes to like a race realist, like or somebody that's into human biodiversity, I would make different arguments and say, hey, like if you think that it's so important to be able to discriminate based on race, same deal. Like it's the government that's preventing that. And I think a lot of those people, they think it's important for those same reasons. And, but like, as you said, to certain people, like to you, those reasons are irrelevant. To you, it's all about competence. And you're not interested in the exact reasons why competence is no longer getting selected for. So talking about human biodiversity to you is irrelevant. But if for people to whom that is a factor that they're interested in, trying to sidestep it and be like, no, those differences don't matter, that's going to make them hostile to what you're trying to sell because you're not selling it in terms of what they're most interested in. So everybody just needs a different, like people that are capable of being on your side on something just need it to be described in ways that demonstrate how that satisfies their own subjective interpretations and interests and values. And I think that this is a big divide, right? This is a big important kind of topic right now that divides people. And unfortunately, with this issue, especially human biodiversity, is the reason that it's become kind of a hot topic and something that demands some attention is because progressives in the left have been so adamant and aggressive in saying, hey, there's systemic oppression and systemic racism, and white people are the root of all evil. And any differences in outcomes between race and between gender as a result of discrimination. Well, in order to push back against that, you know, you kind of have to have an alternative hypothesis to be able to persuade. And if you seed the ground and be like, I'm not required to put forth an alternative hypothesis, then you're giving those people ammunition to be able to
No, I understand. I mean, I
so, but
understand
it depends
where
on the
you're going with
circumstances. It
this.
depends on who you're talking to and who you are arguing with is all I wanted to
Right.
go into.
No, I agree. I agree. Like for the most part, I agree. I guess my point being something like this is that like we seem to be so we have like these factions that are hardening on this subject. And like it might be the case. I'm not saying that I'm giving up, but it might be the case that there really is no bridge to cross anymore when it comes to something like this. But on the off chance that there is, on the off chance that people could say there's a quality to it when it comes to human biodiversity and in that territory where it's sort of like, are we sure that we're not fighting the enemy on their own terms and on their own ground? Like when looking at a battlefield and trying to assess it, like I think one of the most important things is like, are we playing the game by their rules? Are we fighting the battle on their terms? Or are we in some way becoming imaginative and creative and looking at the whole thing from a higher perspective? And that's I don't think that it's necessarily, my opinion, I don't think it's useful at all to like sort of to fight them on their own terms, because their own terms are rigged. We already know that they're completely crazy and evil. Like there is no logic, there is no reason, there's no morality there. It is like the argument, ad infinitum, like where like when you get to the bottom of it, when you scratch away all of the surfaces, I think that you will get to I don't care, including especially on the left that like is sort of like bootstrapped with this whole idea that like, oh, it's all oppression all the way down. All differences of outcomes are the result of some sort of structural oppression. We already know that that's nonsense. Like we know that it's nonsense on stilts, and like I think that there are a lot of people again who innately suspect that, who know it because like we human beings have like there's a difference between like knowledge and sense. And so like we sense that like, well, this is wrong. Obviously, this is stupid. Why are these incompetent clowns, by the way, many of which have white faces? I can't stress that enough. It's like, yeah, I get it. The human biodiversity, like various groups and averages and all of this other stuff. But when we look at the actual hierarchy, we're going to see just essentially incompetence across the board. Even John Carter, in his article about like Claudine Gay, for example, allowed for the possibility, like, yeah, there probably were a lot of Black women that were way more qualified for the job that she held. And yet she was selected, yes, because of race, yes, because of immutable qualities or maybe slightly mutable qualities. She was, and even because of her name, like this is the insanity of what we're up against. But like even he allowed for the idea that like, hey, she was selected because she was incompetent. And
Yeah.
this is a weird thing to contemplate, like the idea of an inverse hierarchy, an upside down pyramid of competence, like where essentially like people are now being selected for how stupid they are. And like and again, I think that transcends, any sort of hard-headed theory about like, about on their terms about like, well, of racial hierarchy, of structural oppression. Like if we fight them on that ground, I just feel like we're not really gaining the type of allies, and I hate to use that word, but we're not really like changing the game. We're just sort of playing it by their rules, I guess is what I'm saying. We're
Hey,
just saying like, well, yeah, good.
I was just gonna say something you brought up. I mean, it underlies the thing, and this may be an area to. I mean, the whole topic of race realism is so nuanced, and it's not all black and white. Pun intended, I guess. It's like, and one of the things is like this distinction between what's meant by an identity, and it's not the racial identity, it's the political identity that drives it, because you'll have somebody, I mean, who's black, and as soon as they you know commit some kind of heresy against the Marxist religion, it's like they're out. So like, I mean, you see the vitriol that white, even progressives will have towards people like Candace Owens or Thomas Sowell, or even somebody like Glenn Lowry, or John McWhorter. It's like you have people. It's like as soon as they so they're black, or like Larry Elder, right? So he's like called he's a white face of blacks, or the black face of white supremacy. All these sorts of things, are like Winsome Sears, that new, Virginia lieutenant governor. So it's like obviously dark skinned, but it's like, but she's like, oh, like called like I forget the word salad. Some MSNBC anchor said it was like, I see a black mouth moving, but white ideas, and on the runway of white supremacy from her mouth, or some kind of crazy nonsense. So anyway, it's like, it's obviously, it's not a racial identity that it's the political identity. And so, maybe there's that tension there, but of course that goes down to like, people like, we have this, whatever it is, innate desire for some kind of religious belief, meaning, or structure in our lives somehow. And so in the absence of that, in this sort of postmodern West, it's like people just latch on to something and seize it and like identify with it. And so it's like, in the case of like progressivism, you have like, it's basically a religion. It operates like one, and it gives people that same sense of, just like in talking to a cult member, about why, like some Jehovah's Witness, or comes to your house and it's like, trying to tell you about whatever. It's like, you have just as much, I mean, it really follows the same pattern in talking to them, because you're not addressing the ideas or the claims. It's like you're some core thing of their identity that's now wedded to this whole ideology, and
Well, I mean, like I could speak anecdotally about that, even with my own wife. There is a like a sort of a horrible little game that's played, particularly with, like, let's say, high IQ black people, particularly black women, where there is a game that's played, and it is a sordid game. And I think it's played actually across racial lines too. Anyone who's been a graduate of the American public school system will probably agree with me that if you are to show any kind of ingenuity or intelligence of any kind, um, that this is something that's punished socially, right? Like you're good, and like and for a black person in particular, at least in my experience, like I mean, this comes with this game. This game is very, very rigged, and it's very, very dangerous, um, uh, because of the environment that we are all raised in, because of this echo chamber of propaganda. There is my wife would probably tell you a lot of things about, like, being called white, being called all kinds of names because of inherent qualities. And so there's a, to me at least, like, it's I guess I'll admit that it's a little bit personal, where there's a I just get this feeling that like maybe the ground that some people are fighting on is not, and I'm not disdaining their character. Like I get the fact that, like, yeah, like things are upside down, and like, so people are like, kind of flailing and saying, like, holy crap, how did this get so out of control? How did everything get so upside down? How did, like, competency get turned on its head? How do we have this situation that we're in right now? And I think that, to me at least, it's a tactical mistake to say, like, okay, like, let's just say that, like, that the reasons for these discrepancies is because someone with these immutable qualities is on average, I hate that word, on the term on average, but like on average is going to be less competent. And it's just sort of like, at a high enough resolution view, what you see, it's like, who would you prefer to be in charge, Joe Biden or Thomas Sowell? You said Thomas Sowell's name, right, Dan?
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
it's just sort of
definitely
like
Thomas Sowell.
at it, yeah. Well, it's just sort of like, so it becomes, to me at least, it becomes a little bit ridiculous that we're actually toying with their concepts of race, when in fact what we're really talking about is, like, is that the competency pyramid has been turned upside down for reasons that have to do with preserving the power of an elite few to essentially enslave the human race. And so it's sort of like like to me at least, like when I try to write about and I haven't really written about race. It doesn't interest me very much, obviously. But like it's sort of like when I write to an audience, I just assume like there's probably going to be all kinds of people out there. Like like again, like in terms of persuasion, like I'm trying to go as fundamental as I can because like I have the opinion, and maybe it's hubristic, maybe it's insane, but I have the opinion that there are probably like this. Forget intelligence, for example. Let's talk about wisdom and sensibility. The idea that like there are a lot of people that understand that something has gone completely fucking haywire, and like to reach as many of those people as possible seems to me to be the best long-term strategy. And at the very least, like I'm not a strategist. I'm a tactician. And so at the very least, like what is immediately to hand to me tactically is like, hey, let's push into this little area. Let's see if like we can like get people to kind of like forget all of their armored opinions, forget about like being embarrassed about knowing something, but instead like look inward and say like, you know what, like something is wrong. Like something's really wrong with all of this, and like and so maybe like a small bore like of what Grant was talking about, like where like I agree with Grant, like in the main, like I agree with him, like libertarianism, like I'm not a I guess I would be like a small L libertarian, in the sense that like, yeah, I understand all of that. Like obviously the market decides. Obviously, like that is the more genuine fount of useful information. And certainly we don't want to like go into this this doom loop of like a bunch of experts in expertology pretending to know about things they can't know and then imposing their stupid insights on everyone else. um I just worry sometimes that like that's in that particular realm. I worry that that's what we're doing. That's all.
Yeah, I just to make it less abstract, I would say the argument that I make, this is the argument that I make on this topic, is that what the reason for differences in outcomes, like first of all, there's always going to be differences in outcomes in a large organization, society at large. There's going to be differences in outcomes, and you can chop those differences up however you want. There's equity is not something of the real world, so there's going to be differences. The cause of those differences is always going to be multifactorial. It's never going to be one thing that causes those differences. And also, as complex as hard science is, in order to get definitive answers, and like most things in hard science, differences in outcomes for various things are multifactorial. That's hard enough. You get into social sciences and the complexities involved in human civilization at scale, and it's just hopelessly complex. These are research questions, essentially, with tremendous bias laid over the top of it. We do not have access to the answers to these questions, and to get answers even in small contexts, like, hey, within this organization, like within the US Army, like the differences in promotion rates of this race to this rank, like how much of that can be attributed to discrimination versus differences in fundamental attributes versus differences in selected career fields, right? Even to answer questions that specific require tremendous resources to be employed. And then I don't trust that we're going to get answers because of the bias inherent in research. So all that to say, we don't have the answers. And so we have the Constitution, we have federal law, and we have the Civil Rights Act. So you can't discriminate based on those things for employment. But the way that that's adjudicated is if you as an individual feel like you're being discriminated against, you have the Equal Opportunity Commission. You know, you can submit a complaint and you can litigate it. Like that is the furthest extent that there should be that should be adjudicated. This idea that we're going to just go ahead and assume a priori that differences in outcomes are the result of discrimination when, hey, I will admit that in certain circumstances, that's going to be a part of it. You know, that's going to probably be a part of the equation. You can't just assume that that's the entire part and then go ahead and employ millions of dollars in resources in order to mitigate that impact, which you don't even know the extent of it. Like you're just going to make the problem worse, and you're going to spend a lot of money doing that. So
I'll do you one better, Grant. It is the whole part of it now. Like it's pretty obvious that DEI or DIE or whatever we want to call it, like it's pretty obvious that this is just a system of racial discrimination. It's just in place. We know it. Like you'd have to be completely blind not to see that this is essentially a anti-white and to some degree anti-Asian form of discrimination. It's just happening. Like that's the reality that we live in. Like it's where we are. Like there's no question in my mind, at least. I mean, maybe somebody else has something
but that's
different
the
to
thing.
say there.
We're talking about persuasion, and a lot of people buy into this assumption. And so I'm putting forth an argument that is intended to be persuasive to everybody, regardless of your priors. So even if you believe that it's all probably discrimination and it's you know, like as you say, like our position is probably that now the discrimination is more directed against you know, Asians, whites, etc., especially in certain contexts like the academic context, which has been proven in court. So I mean, it's really hard to disagree with that. Nevertheless, people on the other side of this issue would come back and say, okay, well, that's warranted because of historical oppression. We're trying to like right those previous wrongs, and you know, they're you know, behind in the overall rat race of life because they were deprived of economic opportunities in past generations. So like like that isn't going to be persuasive to those people, because it's like you're saying, hey, there's discrimination now, but they're going to be like, yeah, and that's good because we need to do that because of historical discrimination. So I'm not trying to focus on this issue so much as I'm providing an example of trying to be persuasive in a way that's going to be broadly applicable. And that's to say, hey, like, let's be honest here. If like, in this argument only applies to people who are scientifically literate. Okay. So if you're scientifically illiterate and you're an ignoramus, this argument's not going to have any impact on you. But if you're scientifically literate, and a lot of people on the left are, you would have to admit that we don't know the overall impact of discrimination on differences in outcomes. And like, so you take somebody like Roland Fryer, you know, who's a legitimate economist with legitimate skills, and you know, he would make that exact argument. He would say, we don't know, we can go find out. But I would come back to Roland Fryer and say, hey, going and finding out costs money, you know? And so if a private company wants to do that, fine. But now with BlackRock and Vanguard and their own DEI initiatives having their fingers on the scales, kind of more or less pressuring companies to do that when they wouldn't do it otherwise, like, is that going to help their bottom line? You know, I don't know. So like it all gets very complicated. I'm just saying, in terms of persuasion, I think focusing on, and this applies to climate stuff, like just being honest in terms of what we can know is an important first step. And then also being honest about, hey, like before you go and try and fix a problem, realize that if you try and fix it with limited information, there is a significant chance that you will make the problem worse.
No,
And
you.
so,
Oh, sorry.
yeah, no, that's it. That's it. I think that that framing is a generally useful framing that then allows you to pivot into going into like what people value subjectively. Because if you like, that framing is based in reality. That is a truth that is not, I think, appreciated as much as it needs to be. The extent to which we don't know things that people think that we're like at the end of history with scientific knowledge, and we understand all the reasons for like for sociology, we don't. It's too complex. It's very difficult to have answers to these questions. And if we do have an answer, it's a hypothesis. Like we don't know these things with such a high degree of certainty that we can then go spend money. And so if people accept that framing, then you can say, hey, okay, well, what do you want? What are your social objectives? What do you want? Like, what are your values? Whatever they are, I'm telling you, if you accept that framing, it's going to be easier to persuade.
Toxic empathy. So
Yeah.
it's sort of like there's a need, in innate need, I think, like for people to think of themselves as good. And so, like, if somebody provides an answer for how you can best feel that, they are going to win. And it could be a real shitty answer. Like, I think that's what we see with BlackRock, with DEI initiatives. Like, they provided this shitty answer that's like simple, though, right? It's incredibly simple because it's literally black and white, and it's that all over again. Like nobody's gonna like stand up here and tell me that like, hey, once upon a time in America, it really sucked to be black, because it did. That's just a thing that happened. Another thing is happening now. And it seems to be along the same lines, along the same game. Maybe we are on the other side of it now, but like that doesn't mean that like it's not the same game. And like the game, like changing the game is like something that I want to try to do with my writing, at least, because the game sucks. Like the game seems to like loop on itself, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of like a break in this rhythm, like where you can say something obvious. Like it's incredibly obvious that somebody like Claudine Gay, for example, impossibly uncredentialed. Like there's no way, shape, or form in any reality that anybody conceive of that you, and I don't want to get into the academic argument right now, but like it's sort of like it's just, you're just looking at it, you're just like, well, this just makes no sense, and maybe it makes less sense. I'll even agree to that. Maybe it makes even less sense than the former forms of
Well,
sort of racial discrimination and animus, but it definitely makes no sense, and
something
it's just sort of like, yeah.
Well, I was just gonna say, I mean, speaking of stuff making no sense, I mean, I've had debates with people or arguments with people about this, you know, and like one of the things I'll bring up is like, you got Ibram Kendi, for example, dude's getting paid six figures a pop, or Robin DiAngelo, so who's white, but Kendi black, it's like six figures a pop to give speeches to like these Wall Street banks and these big corporations, and to run these workshops, and then like his book is promoted, his message is promoted. He's given this huge sinecure at Boston University to do jack shit, in the way of real research. And it's like, does this look, and like his messages, I'm oppressed, we're oppressed because we're black, and it's like, does this look like somebody who's oppressed? I mean, like Malcolm X back in the day, how many Fortune 500 companies and big banks on Wall Street were like paying him six figures a pop to come give them a speech? It's like nobody was, because he was calling real shit out, and like they don't like that. So Ibram Kendi, it's like just the fact that he's doing that and getting paid so well to say the system is racist. Oh, the same system is paying you millions of dollars to preach this message. Like something doesn't add up. Like that ought to just trigger some
fucking Colin Kaepernick. I mean, like, let's be honest. Like, this is stupid. We all know it. It's obvious. It's ridiculous.
It goes to the thing though, like, and this is the larger pattern that maybe people like us, it was kind of like taking the red pill, exiting the matrix, so to speak. Like you see the psychopaths, Harrison's wheelhouse, you know, behind the whole thing. I mean, like George Soros, this motherfucker, like there's no way this dude or George or Bill Gates or take your pick, like that they really believe the shit that they fund, because if they did, they're billionaires. Like, why not you give some of your billions to these people that you claim are so oppressed? Like, you don't believe this shit. You're not sacrificing yourself. Or like climate change. Like, oh, this is existential crisis because there's like, you know, autistic Swedish girls that have this fear because they've been told their whole life, oh, that's going to kill everybody. And yet they'll fund that shit and then go buy beach house mansions. You know, like they obviously don't believe this stuff's happening. And you see it. You see that these people are lying. They're like the wizard behind the curtain, just manipulating people's fears and pushing this narrative. And, you know, and then it's kind of like you feel, at least I do, like really frustrated sometimes in engaging with people who are taking the smoke and mirrors bullshit from the wizard, you know, seriously. Like, we need to argue about the smoke and mirrors that this wizard's putting on because it's so scary. And it's like, dude, it's bullshit. Focus on the man behind the curtain. But they don't, you know what I mean? It's like that. Maybe if we could figure out a way to shift the conversation to that, you know, is like you'll see the memes and they do it pretty well, where it's like there's different ones. One being you see like a cartoon of like the Occupy Wall Street, you know, people black and white coming together, like, you know, the banks have fucked us over. And then some banker is like at his desk saying, all right, now time to tell them about identity politics or whatever. You know, it's like this whole thing where you see the game they're fucking playing, and you see the fact that this person who's arguing with you is just a fucking pawn, willingly like being a useful idiot for some psychopathic elite scum. And it's like, it frustrates you on two levels. Because one, you're like, why are we even having this bullshit argument? Like, it's bullshit. You should see that it's bullshit. But then, you know, it also forces everybody to not address the real evil, which is the psychopath pushing this whole agenda. So it's like, maybe
that's why
redirecting it to that,
yeah.
you know?
Well, that's why I described it as arms dealing, and I knew it was be controversial, but like to some degree, I still think that's the case. Like, in other words, like again, I keep thinking about these people that just want to get through their fucking day. They just want to get through the next, in some case, the next hour. Like it's very weird. Like if you have like a thin like sort of skin, I'd say that about myself, like where or a thin membrane or something, where like you could walk into a room and you just kind of feel it. You just feel the thing happening. You feel like the way that people are interacting with reality. And it's just kind of like, oh man, this is fucking weird. Like this is bad. Like there's there and you the instinct that I have at least is just so okay. So how can like how can you help like a normal person that just is trying to get through their day? Like how can you give them some kind of shield against all of this stuff?
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
I think what you do is you find something in their everyday life that's important to them that is getting interfered with by all this stuff. So for
Yeah.
everybody, it's going to be a different thing, but everybody experiences something that they're frustrated by, and they'll usually tell you about it in a short conversation. And so what I do is, you know, if like I'm sitting on a plane next to somebody and they start talking to me about something, and like immediately I don't, it's not like I intentionally do this. It's just I care so much about all this stuff that it's just what I do when I talk to people. But I immediately start framing all the things that are frustrating them in terms of, you know, government intervention and all of these issues. And I find people are very receptive to that, because it's really not hard to connect the dots. Now, in that process, there's certain tripwires that have been planted by the, you know, media apparatus, you know, that you don't want to step on. So, you know, while you're connecting those dots, you don't want to be like, and Trump's the best man to say no. You know, who's really going to be able to help you with this is that guy that you've been programmed to hate with a visceral passion. No, like you just in a very non-partisan, apolitical way connect the dots between the things that they have concerns with and frustrations with in their everyday life in policy. And you don't need to blame the policy on a particular political party or politician. It's not necessary, because there is like we know, there's a uniparty. It's really those who desire for power to be consolidated and centralized, and people that don't, is really the fundamental divide. So normal people, whether they realize it or not, like, they do not benefit from power being consolidated and taken out of their hands and put in Washington, D.C. They don't. And that's pretty easy to make that argument, even to people that have been programmed to feel like that, to feel like if all the smart people were in charge and everything would be good. You don't have to search very long talking to somebody to find an issue where they're forced to do something against their will that frustrates them, that they think is stupid, that they're forced to contend with, and then explain, hey, wouldn't it be nice if you had the ability not to do that? And then later down in the conversation, like, they're kind of programmed to be frustrated with other people having freedom to do things that they think are stupid. And then you could remind them and say, hey, well, that thing that you feel really strongly about, that's the same kind of deal, right? Like, maybe for that person, those are their values, and like they really want to go do those things, and they think it's best for them. And they're like, yeah, but it's stupid, it's bad for them, it'll kill them. It's like, well, maybe that's how they want to live their life, just like you want to make this decision, and you're not able to because somebody else thinks that they know better than you. And so, like, there's ways to do it, but the way that you do it is you don't transgress against those huge priors. Like, so there's this massive built up meta narrative of prior assumptions that are all completely divorced from reality. And if you let yourself use one of your priors that don't align with that when you're making your argument, and that's stepping on a tripwire, where all of a sudden it's like what? No, like, that's like, that totally screws with that whole constructed meta narrative that they have, and they can't internalize it because of confirmation bias.
Well,
So
I'm curious, like Harrison thinks of this, like in terms of logocracy, like where, because again, like we're talking about, and I have to admit, like I'm not really even sure, like if there is an intersection between the libertarianism that Grant's talking about and logocracy as Harrison sees it. Like what would you, like Harrison, like what would you think ultimately, like if we were to inhabit like some sort of a system that again like promoted both sort of freedom of expression, but in a way that that prevented, and I agree with you in many ways, like I'm still a student of yours, but like I agree with you in many ways that like yeah, there are perverse incentives. There is a ladder of some sort that allows psychopaths to climb it and to ascend into these positions where they can just sort of, like in my view, like they can just print out like nth number of weapons, like to all of like their particular slaves. um like can you figure out like what would to you be the bridge from like from a libertarianism of that Grant describes, which I kind of subscribe to, into something where like, okay, wiser heads prevail and can stop that ascension of like essentially pathological rulers from taking control.
Tough
I'm
question.
sorry, that was a big question.
But well, I don't know. I'll just say that. But if we just looking at like the past 100 years for precedents, then I would say that one like surefire way, or one that at least has some precedent, would be like in the Eastern Bloc, where you get taken over, like in like 1950, around that year, late 40s, early 50s, and then you suffer for like 40 years. And after 20, 30 years of suffering, you start kind of like building a kind of totally decentralized bottom-up social network, essentially, that all of you kind of recognize that, like, all the previous divisions kind of fall apart. You know, previously rich people will be talking to previously poor people. Now they're all kind of like equally poor for the most part, and people of different religions, people of different ethnic backgrounds, they're all talking to each other, and they're all kind of uniting against, they all kind of agree, well, whatever differences we had, it's nothing compared to the differences we've got with the ruling power, you know, the state, the existing structure, power structure. And then during the 80s, kind of a resistance movement kind of starts up, like Solidarity in Poland, until everything kind of just reaches a critical mass. Of course, there's geopolitics going on at the same time, but there's questions about all the stuff that happened afterwards. But at least the dynamic was, okay, now we get rid of all of the people that were in charge. You know, it wasn't done. What came afterwards wasn't done very well, or, you know, ideally. But that would be kind of the direction. It's like, suffer for a few decades until the society of normal people, as Lobachevsky calls it, actually starts getting along and organizing, and then everything kind of falls into place after that. There's no there, in that situation, there wasn't even a need for violent counter revolution or revolution, however you want to like view it. That's one way of doing it. That's one way how it happens. Now, what happens afterwards, of course, that's a whole other question. That's at least seems to be the way that things played out this last time, you know, in the last 100 years. As for other options, you know, who knows? There's probably a lot possible. Lobachevsky was, you know, he saw, he considered himself not a revolutionary, but an evolutionist in the social and historical sense, not necessarily from the, like, you know, Darwinian biological sense, but that things develop most healthily, most gradually. So just completely tearing down an existing system probably won't turn out very well, because in the process you destroy all, you know, you might be destroying and tearing down all the things you think are bad about the system, but you end up tearing down a whole bunch of things that actually, in retrospect, you find out were actually probably things that should have been retained. So he wasn't a revolutionary in that sense at all.
Well, maybe that's a good place to wrap up, because what I was thinking was that if we are writing about the same things, the four of us here, but also lots of other people in our network, it would be about, probably, and if there was any way that we could all be called right wing, it would probably be that we're writing about the things that need to be retained, which is a difficult subject, and probably a subject that requires a lot more time and effort than we've been able to supply today. But
Retained or restored.
Yeah, or restored. And like, and I agree. And it's just sort of like, so maybe this is a topic for a different time, but I just want to thank everybody for joining us on today's Tonic Discussions, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.
And one quick thing to just add, hey, if you haven't already subscribed to it, the podcast, in case we get booted off of YouTube at some point, where this is also available as an audio podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all those other things. So look for it there. And of course, subscribe to our Substacks and stay in the loop in case YouTube doesn't like our discussion of truth at some point.